This is one of the earliest tarot cards. This was painted about 1465 in northern Italy by Andrea Mantegna, one of the great artists of the Renaissance. That tarot deck did not have 78 cards. It had only 50 cards, and all 50 were major arcana, and this is the 49th card. This is the way in which the early Hermetic Renaissance recognized the penultimate accumulation of the cosmos, and it was called the Primo Mobile. And this angel has 1 foot on the earth and is holding a clear sphere up. But you'll notice that the earth is also clear. In the card just before it, called the Octavia Sphera, the 8th sphere, the sphere that the angel is holding up is full of stars. Do you remember in 2001, the astronaut who went through all that? And then in 2010, they went out to Jupiter and they found the alien black icon, and the last thing the man said, "My God, it's full of stars." It is a Hermetic Renaissance idea that there is an 8th sphere which is full of stars. Now this is vision 4. And we're in the 4th presentation, and these 4 presentations make a set. They make a square, as it were. And we do this 3 times, and those 3 squares link together, and as they link together, they lose their squaredness, and they become, first of all, a double square. And a double square was always the way in which one understood that this is the proportion of a music room. And you can find a double cubed music room here in Los Angeles at the Huntington. Inside the Huntington, on the 2nd level, you will find a classic Renaissance music room. Its proportions are exactly 20 feet by 20 feet high and 40 feet long. It is a double cube, a double square in floor plan. That is an 8. That is an octave. This is the way in which one sets up a space in which one will hear the harmony. It is important to realize that if you add another square to that, you then get a rectangle. And if you get a rectangle, it will now have a different kind of a proportion. It will have 3 squares or 3 cubes that are aligned together. And if you look at this in an abstract geometricity, you will find that that particular geometric shape occurs 20,000 years ago in the Paleolithic cave of Lascaux. One of the very few clear symbolic geometric shapes in Paleolithic art is a square that has 2 vertical lines, making the square divided into 3 rectangles. And if you have 3 rectangles that are brought together, you reconstitute a square, but on a very large, expanded quality that has taken advantage not just of pairs and 4s, but of 3s coming into play. And when you begin to have 2s, 3s, and 4s, you begin to then have the fundamental quality of an expanded harmonic that is able to go into ratios that are universal. By the time of the Hermetic Renaissance in northern Italy, in Florence, in Milano, in Venice, in several of Vicenza, several of the other northern Italian cities, by 1465, it was apparent that one was in a position for the very first time in almost 1,000 years to recover the essential wisdom of classical antiquity, because one had refreshed the vision. And it is the vision that carries the quintessential fifth element into play, so that now your ratios are expanded to include a visionary dimension in addition to the geometricity of space. In addition to natural space, one now has a transformed space that is a spiritual space. And when you have ratios of 1s and 2s, 3s and 4s and 5s, now you have the full set by which you can create a fundamental series of ratios that hold forever everywhere. They are not only universal now, but they reach to the cosmic. And that is to say, they would be universal if they were in the natural order, but they become cosmic because they have transcended the limitations of the natural order and gone into the spiritual order. And the spiritual order is different from the natural order. The natural order must base itself on ritual existence, on the way things are, because the actions of the universe produce objective results. If you do such and such and so, in this sequence, the result will be objectively known, and exactly that, it will be existential. And so natural order bases its objectivity on the existential bodies in their actions, in the sequences of their actions. If you do these steps universally, you will get such and such a result. But the spiritual conscious order is different. If you bring into play a transforming quintessential operator, the natural order now will display an array of possibilities and not the objectivity of limited sets. And so the kind of form now that can come out of a quintessential five-dimensional spirit space-time, conscious space-time, those forms will not be objective in the way in which nature is objective. They will be objective in the way in which consciousness is objective. And consciousness is objective in its array of possibilities, being resonantly gatherable in sets that can be appreciated, that can be critiqued and improved and tuned. And when one tunes the conscious sets of differential objectivity, they are in tune not just with nature qua nature, but they are now in tune with a cosmos that is objective as a higher registry of the way in which art forms and spiritual person forms are now objective as resonant arrays of possibilities. Not confused possibilities, but resonantly arrangeable into sets. And so one has tarot decks from 1465 in which there are 5 sets of 10. And the controlling set for the whole series of 50 cards, 5 sets of 10, the controlling set is the way in which the conditions of man are jumped. The first 10 cards are conditions of man. The second 10 are Apollo and the 9 muses. And Apollo and the 9 muses are the introduction of the first transform. Because the muses are not goddesses of nature, they are goddesses of processes that lead to art forms. And so the master of ceremonies of the muses is Apollo. He is the harmonic of the resonance of all 9 muses together. And while nature puts its registry in pairs that square and then become 8, consciousness puts its sequence in triads that cube and have 9 instead of 8 as a basic working calibration. So that whenever one would see 8s, one would know you're working with the natural order, but when you see 9s, you know that you're working with a spiritual order, a conscious visionary order. And so one finds a double sequence that both start with 1, but proceed on one axis by squaring and proceed on the other axis by cubing. So the 1 becomes in one axis 1, 2, 4, 8, but in the other axis 1, 3, 9, 27. And the shape of those 2 axes that came together were called classically by the Greek letter lambda. And one finds this lambda in Plato's great final dialogue, the Timaeus. And it is not invented by Plato, but is the culmination of all of his dialogues that base themselves on the Pythagorean tradition. And Pythagoras got his tradition from studying for 22 years in Heliopolis in Egypt. And the Egyptians in the Heliopolitan recension got it all the way back, formed already in the original Old Kingdom when the pyramids were built, and they got it direct from the last vestiges of the Paleolithic world in the Sahara Desert when it was still fertile, and they got it because of 70,000 years of Homo sapien wisdom traditions in Africa, dating back at least that far, almost halfway back to the origin of the species Homo sapiens sapien. So that when one talks about a wisdom tradition, you're talking about waves that when they are visionarily put together, they form a resonant calibration that can be put into sets. And these sets include not only time and space, but a conscious transform dimension that yields a new kind of form. And we'll find it is the artistic spiritual person who is the first registry, almost as if they are emerging from a 5-dimensional continuum. So the forms of persons and of art and of spirits are not natural forms, but supernatural forms. This was something that was apparent east and west. And by west, we have to include in the west India. Everything from Ireland to India and up into Tibet is of the same harmonic in terms of transform conscious dimensions. China and Japan, Korea, Northern Siberia, Central Asia are of a different harmonic, a different registry. Both of these harmonics developed at the very same time the capacity for visionary alchemy. And both of them developed it in the 300s BC. Before then, metallurgy, making metals, had been around for several thousand years. It was a metallurgical process. It was never consciously linked to a visionary alchemy until that time. In China, the tradition was always that the original vision of its civilization went back to 3000 BC. The same as in the West, where the Egyptian vision always went back to the founding of the first dynasty in Egypt about 3000 BC. So both traditions date themselves the last 5,000 years, 5,000 years ago, and the figure in Egypt is Narmer, who unites all of the nomes of Egypt into one single country, First Dynasty Egypt. And in China, it's Fuxi who makes a cosmic order out of the 3 trigrams that eventually would become united together as the hexagrams of the I Ching. So that in the Chinese tradition, the I Ching operates as the calibration which the pyramid texts operate in Egyptian tradition and history. The I Ching goes through 2 major transforms in 3,000 years. The first major transform from Fuxi's trigrams is made when the Zhou Dynasty begins about 1200 BC, when the founders of the Zhou Dynasty, King Wen and his son King Wu and his brother the Duke of Zhou, founded the Zhou Dynasty. They transformed the I Ching from a heavenly celestial order of Fuxi to an earthly human order of human ratios, human relationalities. Instead of there being ratios of fundamental natural occurrences, wind, water, fire, earth, the relationships were now familial. Father, mother, son, sister, brother, eldest, middle, youngest. So that you get, about 1200 BC, you get an I Ching which is humanized. And one now has a correlation between a celestial order which also has a recalibration in a familial order. And because of this, by about 500 BC, there had to be a resolving way in which that celestial and that familial order were brought together. And the resolving way was made by 2 geniuses who, one of them came about 50 years, born about 50 years before the other, but both were contemporaneous. One is an old man and one is a vibrant young man just coming into his kin. The old man was Lao Tzu, the young man was Confucius, Confucius. Lao Tzu's book, the Tao Te Ching, established the way in which one can make a celestial and a human ratio calibration in proportion. The Tao in the Tao Te Ching, the first half of the book, is all about heaven's order. The Te is all about man's order. And that when you bring Tao and Te together, proportionately, the transforms of both interpenetrate in such a way that it gives you a ratioed recalibration. Not just heaven, nor not just earth, but heaven and earth together, all the time in varying proportions. What Confucius did was to take the new ratios of the Tao Te Ching, the human I Ching from the Zhou Dynasty, the celestial trigram I Ching from before there was a dynastic China back to Fuxi, and redid it in a spectacular way. He realized that while the new ratios of Tao and Te united heaven and earth together in these universal proportions, it didn't provide with a way in which the proportions could be humanly understood. One would have to become almost a sage in order to understand, because the ratios were calibrated by heaven being the common denominator and the numerator just being man. And so he turned that upside down and made man the denominator and heaven the numerator. And he did this by adding commentaries to the I Ching of the Zhou Dynasty, so that the revised human I Ching of the Zhou Dynasty received 10 commentaries by Confucius, and they're called the 10 Wings. And the 10 Wings are a way of making not a Tao Te transform, but of making a Gen E transform. That while Tao is definitely universal in its nature, in its primordial mystery, and Te is unity in its objective existential oneness, Gen is the human-heartedness, which is the third of the phases, but it has a numerical value of 2. Whereas the E are the symbols in the mind, and it's the 4th phase, but it has a numerical quality of 3. And so Confucius, by adding commentaries to the I Ching, humanized the I Ching in a transformed conscious way by basing it on Gen E. And for about 150, 200 years, there was a struggle between the two schools. Do you make your ratios by Tao Te, or do you make them by Gen E? The resolution came when 2 great thinkers lived at the same time, one who was the inheritor of Confucius and became almost as famous as Confucius himself, and his name is Mencius. And Mencius is the quality where the Confucian understanding took precedence almost permanently in social realms over the Lao Tzu. And the Mencius, the best little translation is the Penguin Classics. It's important to follow this, because this is what we're doing. This is a yoga. And a yoga must be practiced without missing a beat. Otherwise, you don't notice that the transform has happened. Mencius says, heaven's favorable weather is less important than Earth's advantageous terrain, and Earth's advantageous terrain is less important than human unity. So that one has the Gen E turned, and it now has its Te, not in the Te of existence, but in the Te of society. And so if you have the Gen E, the heart and mind calibration, its unity is no longer the natural order of existence, but is the social order of man's world. This seemed natural and sensible to almost all of the Chinese at the time and became the standard of Chinese society ever after that for 2,300 years. The person who took exception to this was the person we're taking in our vision, Chuangzi. And Chuangzi took exception to the fact that it isn't just Tao-Te ratios. It isn't just Gen-E ratios, but that there is a fifth mysterious spiritual dimension, visionary consciousness, as we would call it, that doesn't recalibrate so much as that it composes whole new kinds of proportions that were never seen before. And so in Chuangzi, for the first time, you find a counter tradition to the Confucian social order, and the counter tradition is that there is always the rare, unique, one-of-a-kind happenings that are equally real. And so the Taoist tradition ever after is to respect the singular uniqueness, that it only happens once ever in the universe. Nevertheless, it is as real as something that happens all the time. And so strange rocks, peculiar plants, odd hermits out in the wilds, all of these become favorites of Taoism. They become the sense that a visionary alchemy does not produce the usual, but produces the unusual. And that the unusual is not calibrated, it is frequently one of a kind. And so Chuangzi is famous for saying, Lao Tzu could ride the wind and go soaring around with cool and breezy skill. But after 15 days, he came back to earth. As far as the search was for good fortune went, he didn't fret and worry. He escaped the trouble of walking, but he still had to depend on something to get around. If he had only mounted on the truth of heaven and earth, ridden the changes of the 6 breaths, and wandered through the boundless, then what would he have had to depend on? Therefore I say, the perfect man has no self, the holy man has no merit, the sage has no fame. This takes the Taoist alchemical sage out of the whole social calibration permanently. They are not confined to that social world. And so they have a different language that they use. The social world uses a language that is polarized to make comparisons and distinctions, whereas the Taoist alchemical sage uses a poetic language that is spontaneous, and its meanings only occur once right then. Out of Chuangzi will come the Chinese tradition that eventually becomes Zen. The Zen master laughs at the social world because it arrogantly considers itself real, whereas the Zen master considers the entire social world as only one example of one possibility in a cosmos of equally real possibilities that just haven't happened yet, or maybe aren't recognized, aren't sensitized to. So that the Taoist alchemical tradition is one where perfection is also complete freedom, and one doesn't go out of the social world, one doesn't drop out of the social world. One puts a parenthesis around the social world and says that's only one note on one instrument, one time played. And the cosmos is so vast, we may never hear that note again forever. So for the Taoist, It's a question that the entire social world, the entire earth, is only one speck of dust in a starry expanse of unlimited cosmic reality. Just how many planets around how many stars and how many galaxies are there? World without end. And that this one, this social world that is happening at such and such a time and such a year is, what, a minuscule fraction of the age of the earth. And who knows how long the earth will be here, maybe another 10 billion years. So what is a generation on this particular place? That's reality. And so the whole notion of visionary alchemy in the Chinese tradition was always to penetrate through the illusion of the social realm, of the conditioned temporality of something, of the standardized space of something, of the reduced and reductive transform, limited consciousness of those realms that have no creativity, they have no imagination. Now, the Western complement to that, the Hermetic tradition, read out somewhat differently, but came to an amazingly complementary understanding. Its visionary alchemy was from a different basis. Its visionary alchemy had not so much the uniqueness of one leading to the infinity, but the Western understanding of it was that there is a zero-ness that leads to infinity. It is the zero-ness which doesn't just lead to infinity, but is indistinguishable on every level of approach from infinity. And indeed, in Western logic, in any mathematic that the West ever developed, you can use zero and infinity in the same computations and come up with the same result. And the result is that it is permanently mysterious. When quantum physics was getting really deep into real alchemy, really changing elements into another, one of the great teachers of Niels Bohr and the developers of quantum mechanics was Lord Rutherford in England, Cambridge, at the Cavendish laboratory. And his last book, just before he died, is called A Newer Alchemy, about how we now know how to change lead into gold for real. In fact, we can change any elements into anything. We can make, in fact, new elements that never were. And of course, the first new element that was eventually made very soon after that was plutonium. Highly radioactive and death-dealing for geologic ages. The Western alchemy was always based on the realization that if you got to a perfect equanimity, a perfect rest, that rest would vanish from the calibration of oneness. It would disappear into a permanent zero-ness. Now, the realization of the zero-ness was so difficult to put into a symbolic mode that it was not able to be symbolized exactly and precisely until about the middle of the 2nd century AD in India. And the great sage who was able to symbolize zero for the first time, his name was Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna called that zero shunyata, the void. And said of it, that shunyata, that void, always pairs itself with oneness, which is tathata. Not oneness so much, but because in its pairedness, voidness pairs not with one, but voidness pairs with, the best English translation was suchness. Suchness. It isn't existence, it's what's there before existence. Before existence objectifies itself, there's a mysterious suchness that allows for existence to emerge. And so the suchness is not one so much, but the mysteriousness out of which oneness can be one. It can achieve reality as one. And so the deep realization in the West is that it isn't void and one. It isn't a binary of 0 and 1. It's a binary of 0 and mystery that allows one to emerge. And so in the Western tradition, it was always that consciousness is magical in that it transforms because it makes a pair which is not paired but is turned in such a way that they curl together and make a complementarity. When the Western alchemical vision tradition first touched the Chinese, they were shocked that they understood each other but not in parallel ways, but in reciprocal ways. It was an astounding meeting for them. And one of the most astounding facts that emerges out of deep, cultivated, learned, historical understanding is that Hellenistic Judaism played a trigger role in the development of the Western Hermetic tradition, and not only in Palestine or in the Persian world or in the Egyptian world, but in India as well. And the way that Hellenistic Judaism got to India is because St. Thomas, Doubting Thomas, took it there in 41 AD. And for the first time, you had a transform of the original Buddhism that had been there by that time for 500 years. That Buddhism that had been there for 500 years, based on wanting to have enlightenment, to be freed from suffering, to be permanently in a state of nirvana where suffering no longer occurs at all, that Buddhism was transformed a second time. The first transform, by achieving enlightenment, was said to be the preparation only. That the real double transform after that was a distillation of enlightenment into a new form. And the new form was not a Buddha, but was a Bodhisattva. And so the Mahayana was born out of the impact of Hermetic Hellenistic Judaism coming into contact with India for the first time. And in between 41 AD, when Thomas arrived there in southern India and Kerala, within 50 years, Ashvaghosha wrote one of the most astounding books in the world. It's not about awakening to enlightenment in Buddhism, but the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. And you never find in Buddhism the need for faith until Ashvaghosha. Faith is a Hellenistic Jewish quality of not just hoping for something, but of preparing one for the second transform. We're going to take a break and we'll come back. Last week, when we were looking at the way in which very sophisticated language came out about 2,000 years ago, and the classic document in that language is the Gospel according to John. The Greek of the Gospel according to John is so refined that it does acrobatic pirouettes with grammar that are almost impossible to follow in watching the way in which the steps of the words happen, and you have to almost use an intuition to see a magical movement. And it's as if St. John was like a magician with the syntax and grammar of Greek language, and he does legerdemain that you can't quite follow every step, and yet you realize that you've gone through some kind of pirouette, some kind of a ballet tumble, and you are now repositioned in a completely new orientation that is resonantly related to where you were just a few words ago, and yet how you got here is mysterious. St. John says of this is the wind of the Spirit. You don't know where it came from, and you don't know where it goes. All you know is that here it did this, and so now things are different. This is the transform operator of what in the Asian tradition in India is called the High Dharma. The traditional Buddha taught the Dharma, but the transformation of Buddhism into the Mahayana taught the High Dharma. It's different. It's a different thing. It has, instead of being satisfied to be in nirvana, it has a transform that does something magical with that and says, it is not that I want to be in nirvana, but that I want the entire cosmos to be in nirvana, and then I will join that. So there is a peculiar quality to that. It is that until the entire universe becomes cosmically saved, one is not going to save oneself at all, even though you're able to do so. This is not a deferred salvation, but it is a conscious expansion of it to include that the salvation is not for the natural individual. That the symbolic individual who is the center of their mind is not the object of this salvation. This is a salvation that is transformed. That spiritual form of the person, the conscious person, is on a higher calibration, a deeper penetration than the individual that one has in one's mind. The I, who I am, is in my mind as an idea of myself symbolized by my identity, and it's aligned with my body. So that body and mind definitely are aligned. But the spiritual person is not in an alignment, isn't in a sequence. Instead occurs emerging out of a mysterious space that's in between the mind and the spirit. And that space in between is where the winds of visionary consciousness blow. And they have a movement which is distinctly different from the movement in between the mind as an objective idea of oneself, one's identity, and the objective existential body. In between the body and the mind is also a process of movement called experience. Now we call it myth here in our education, because that mythic horizon has, in its flow, it has qualities of images, qualities of feeling, and qualities of language, oral language. And next week, when we start a whole new set of 4, one of the works that we're going to use is one of the most visionary works on the planet by a woman who wrote it in 1260 AD, and her name was Mexild of Magdeburg. And she wrote it, and it was forgotten for exactly 600 years. And it was found in 1860, 600 years later, almost to the day. And since then has achieved its place as one of the greatest mystical writings on the planet. And she was extraordinary, and she called it the flowing light of the Godhead. That to her, God was not on a throne up there or out there someplace, but was a flowing light that she only knew was real because she re-emerged out of that, and not out of her mind and not out of her body. She re-emerged out of vision and emerged into a spiritual form that was resonance grouped together in harmonics. And so she wrote her mystical visions in a very high Dharma poetry, and exquisite as it is. And we're going to pair with her because we're always pairing things together to allow them to have not just compare and contrast, but to have proportion and ratio, and also to be able to act as tuning forks for the movements of our process and for the registry of our forms. And so we're going to pair with her one of the most visionary books that was at the end of the Enlightenment in Europe and at the beginning of the Romantic period in Europe, right on the cusp between them. And that work is On the Aesthetic Education of Man by Friedrich Schiller, Goethe's great friend. And we'll see that in Schiller's poetic, visionary way, he saw that one of the most difficult things was to understand that art was not a natural form, but was a supernatural form. And it's one of the beginnings of the Romantic period where man individually was heroic because he could leave his comfortable social world and go adventuring off into the unknown and bring something precious back with him and reintroduce it and change life. Change not only oneself, but change the world. So that while the Enlightenment in Europe was all about perfecting everything by reason, the Romantic period was about heroically changing everything. It was an age of revolution. Just because the social world is this way doesn't mean we have to accept it. We can change it. And not only change it once, we can change it as many times as we need to change it. On every level, beginning with ourselves. We can change ourselves indefinitely and not just become someone else as an alter ego or as a new identity, but we might become a whole array of possible selves. And that the common denominator of this whole array in the West was always that it is a zero, infinite quality. One hardly ever identifies Count Leo Tolstoy as a Hermetic master, but he was. And towards the end of his life, when he was 80 years old, had become one of the greatest authors of all time. War and Peace, Anna Karenina, so forth. Was Count Leo Tolstoy, had a great estate, Yasna Polyana, which is a national monument of Russia ever since. The last year of his life, Tolstoy went through a transformation crisis that he thought was over. In 1886, they did a census of Moscow, and Count Tolstoy was assigned the slums of Moscow to count the people. And it was so devastating to him that he had an emotional and mental breakdown. And he said that for years he had to hide every gun in the house because he was tempted just to kill himself. That human life had become so abjectly horrific for so many people, there was no way that there could, not only that it could not be helped, but there must be no God. And it devastated him. And finally emerged out of that. In the last year of his life, he kept a diary. And it's in the diary that one finds the Hermetic ratio. He said, I have finally found a way to express God to myself. God is x over 0. The unknown numerator over the mysterious perfect 0. And yet that ratio together is infinitely creative. That when the unknown and the 0 come together in proportion, they create a harmonic which makes invisible resonances come together into visibility, into new forms. Forms that are not existentially just there, but forms that are jewel-like and sparkle. And that God literally makes the sparkling heavens as his kind of necklace, his kind of jewelry. Last week we talked about, brought in the Gospel according to St. John, because it's deeply related to one of the works that we're using with in this first set of 4 presentations. And I'm pairing it with the Chinese Taoist classic, the Chuang-Tzu. And the work that we're using is the first of the Hermetic documents called the Poimandres. And the reason we brought in St. John is that the language of the Gospel of St. John is exactly that of the Hermetic Poimandres. This is a study published by Cambridge University Press in England by the greatest biblical scholar of that day, C.H. Dodds. He was the big professor in theology. And this is from the interpretation of the 4th Gospel, and he has 50 pages on the Hermetic background of the New Testament. Not the New Testament of Mark and Luke, but the New Testament of St. John. Not of Paul, but of St. John. And we were alluding to one of the things that happens in the Gospel of St. John, which is the woman taken in adultery. And in chapter 7 of the Gospel of St. John, it reads that she is accused because she's been found red-handed in an act of adultery, and she's brought to the temple in Jerusalem to be accused and then stoned to death. And in that little section, Jesus makes the spectacular statement, let whoever has not sinned, whoever is pure from this act, cast the first stone, and no one could cast it. And he let her go and said, I find no fault with you either. Go and live. That particular section of St. John does not occur originally in the Gospel of St. John. It is, if you look at the Cambridge Bible Commentary or any of the sophisticated commentaries, one finds that it is put in an appendix at the end because it's not in the original Gospel of John. It was placed in there by people who revised these things. You have to understand that things have been revised for 2,000 years. Fortunately, a copy of the Gospel of St. John was found about 2 generations ago. Enough fragments so that we can see it's in one of the great libraries in England in Manchester, the John Rylands Library. And it dates from 130 AD and was found in Egypt. And this section does not appear. Where it does appear in St. John is in chapter 4, and it doesn't occur. The event doesn't occur at all in Jerusalem. It occurs at a well in Samaria. And it's very important to understand the vision that's going on here. If it occurs in Jerusalem in the temple, it is a question of Jesus challenging the law. An adulteress should be stoned to death by Jewish law. But when it shifted to the well, this shifts the entire vision, and its meaning becomes clear and an expansion, a harmonic that almost exceeds the ability of someone to put a form on it. That well is called Jacob's well. Now, if you come from the Mediterranean Sea into Palestine, into what is today Israel, the coast is rather bereft of indentations. It's difficult to find harbors. When they built Caesarea, they had to dig out an artificial harbor just to make a city there. And about from 8 to 30 miles inland is a plain called the Plain of Sharon. And behind that is a huge ridge of mountains. And on that ridge, which is almost unbroken, in the far, as you come up from the Mediterranean on the far right, Jerusalem is up on the top of that ridge. And on the other side of that ridge, it goes down rather steeply to the Jordan River Valley and the Dead Sea. Breaking that ridge, there's only one natural pass. And that natural pass goes all the way through at a fairly easy pass. And there in ancient times was the central crossroad of the caravan route that came north and south, down from Damascus, all the way eventually down to Egypt. And the coastal route that came from the Mediterranean Sea over to the caravan route that came down. And where the caravan route came down from Damascus, it crossed the Jordan River at a certain place so that one could get through this pass and then go on to the coastal cities as well as go down the coast to Egypt, so that there was this natural confluence. And it's there at that natural confluence that the first caravan routes that were run from Mesopotamia to Egypt had to have a place where they could have their well. Now, it's called Jacob's well because it was reestablished by Jacob, but the first person to make a place there was the man who ran those caravans originally. He ran them because his ancestors were in the caravan business, and his father ran the biggest caravans in the world at the time. His father's name was Terah, and the man's name was Abraham. And Abraham positioned two wells, one there at that pass, and the community that formed in ancient times there was called Shechem. And it was a community where that pass was in between two fairly high peaks. They were rounded hills. The highest hill was an ancient Canaanite spot for divine contact and sacrifices, and is called in ancient times Ebal. It's like El Baal. It's God's place. The other hill was let go and was not commandeered by the ancient Canaanites. And so when Abraham wanted to find a place to offer a special sacrifice that was necessary, he chose the other mountain. The other mountain is called Mount Gerizim. And Jacob's well is at the foot of Mount Gerizim, right where the caravan route coming north and south first contacts the caravan route that goes then over to the Mediterranean Sea. And the reason that Abraham needed to use Mount Gerizim for a sacrifice was that there was a deep challenge to their visionary reality. He needed to renew his sense of covenant with God. And so he wasn't just offering any sacrifice, he took his son Isaac up there to sacrifice Isaac on the top of Mount Gerizim. So that Mount Gerizim is the first place that any of the traditional Jewish patriarchs went to sacrifice his son. This is a very, very deep thing in the Jewish tradition. It's this particular sacrifice of one's son is called the Akedah. And it literally means to bind one's son and deliver him sacrificially to death so that others may live. It is the masculine version, in a way, of the Oedipus complex. And in fact, one of the great studies of it is called Isaac and Oedipus. But the son's relationship to the mother, which is forbidden, you may not marry your mother. But the relationship to the father is that you may not refuse the relationship of commitment to the father, but the father must not kill you. Must not bind you in this way. And one of the qualities of this turns out to be a thing that Abraham learned in his relationships at the other well. And the other well, not what became Jacob's well, the other well was in the southern part where the fertile land of Palestine suddenly becomes desert and is desert all the way into Egypt, all the way into the Nile Delta. And that place, because there is the last stream that occurs there, and the stream is called Beer, and so the place was called Beersheba. And Abraham made a pact with the leader, the head warlord of the time of that place in Beersheba, and his name was Ablamech. And one of the best recountings of it is in a book published in Philadelphia in the 1880s, and this is the second edition, 1893, The Blood Covenant, a Primitive Rite in its bearing on Scripture. Because the attempted sacrifice of Isaac on Mount Gerizim is related to the sacrifice that was made at Beersheba, at that place. And the sacrifice was a blood sacrifice. We're familiar with it with the American Indians. Each man cuts his wrist and they let their blood flow together. The ancient sacrifice was that each man cuts himself and lets his blood fall on 7 stones that are arranged, rather like the Pleiades. And their mutual blood on those 7 stones makes then those stones a holy covenant between them, and those stones then are the boundary stones that mark out the rights and privileges of using that well. And so Abraham's well, still called that in Beersheba, although it's one wouldn't recognize it now. It has been redug several times in the 4,000 years, and it is now a tourist trap. It's a little thing in a hotel lobby thing, and one can go there and have your photograph taken next to Abraham's well in Beersheba. But the important thing here is that Abraham learned that you can't just make boundary stones. That's like marking out the terrain on the earth. One has to have a deeper sacrifice. And so Ablamech at that time said, well, what we use for that is that we sacrifice, instead of on our blood on 7 stones, we sacrifice 7 male lambs, 7 ewe lambs. And so the sacrifice of 7 lambs took the place of the 7 boundary stones, because this is a more expansive, wider covenant. It covers many things, not just that well. And so when Isaac was about to be sacrificed by his father Abraham, a vision came to him that one could, instead of sacrificing one son, one could sacrifice a lamb. And that's the first time that a paschal lamb comes into the Jewish tradition. But Isaac was so scarred by his relationship to his father that he became a cautious, conniving type of an individual. And when his wife, Rebekah, had twin sons, those twin sons, Jacob and Esau, Esau was the firstborn, and so he was the one that should inherit the patriarchy, but his mother moved Isaac's hand so that he blessed Jacob instead of his 1 minute older brother Esau. And so he had the laying on of hands that he was the next patriarch. But his mother, Rebekah, understanding the father and understanding the slightly older son, understanding the psychology, made a point saying, Jacob must marry carefully. He cannot marry here because everything here has been taken over by the Hittites. The Hittites are from Anatolia, from what is today Turkey. And they not only took over Palestine, they took over Egypt for several hundreds of years. And it's the Hyksos invasion of Egypt, the Hittites coming into Egypt, that ended the Old Kingdom. And when the Old Kingdom ended, there were centuries where Egypt was run by the Hittite power. They were literally captive. At the same time that the Jews were captive in Egypt, Egypt was captive to the Hittites. So Jacob's mother said he has to find a Jewish bride, a Semitic bride, and there aren't enough of us here to choose from, so he has to go where most of the Semitic people still live, and that is in Mesopotamia. And so Jacob went to Mesopotamia. He went specifically to where his father's father's father, where his father's grandfather, Abraham's father, ran the original caravans out of, and that is Haran, which is in Iraq today, slightly north and to the west of Mosul. Haran is the city of the moon goddess. And so Jacob went there, and as everyone probably knows, he went there, and the most powerful man of the time was named Laban, and he had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, and Jacob wanted to marry Rachel. And he agreed to work for Laban for 7 years to be able to receive Rachel. He didn't have money to make the bride payment, so he gave 7 years of his labor and his talent and his life as the bride price. But on the wedding night, Laban tricked him and sent in the older unmarried sister, Leah. And so the marriage was consummated between Leah and Jacob. And Laban said, well, you can have the younger sister as well, but it takes another 7 years to pay for that bride price. And so Jacob worked for 14 years to receive the 2 wives. Leah gave birth to son after son after son while he waited to work and get Rachel. And those sons of Leah are the majority of the 12 patriarchs of Judaism. The firstborn was Reuben. Finally, after all this time, after not only 14 years, but after several more years, Rachel, in her older age, gave birth to a son, and his name was Joseph. And Joseph would be one of the most famous figures in the world. It was at this time that Jacob decided to move his children, his wives, their maidservants, and so forth, back to where Shechem was, back to that pass. And when he came back, That's when he acquired the well. Reacquired it because now it was Jacob's well, because he would have all of these sons. He had 11 sons at that time. And then Rachel, in her very old age, got pregnant again with another boy whose name would be Benjamin. So Jacob would have 12 sons that became the 12 patriarchs of the 12 tribes, and one daughter named Dinah. And when they went back there, Dinah was so beautiful and gorgeous, she was raped by the two most powerful figures at the time in that geography, and two of the sons of Jacob, who were very tough guys, Simeon and Levi, said, the only way for you to escape God's punishment for doing this to our sister is that all of the men are going to have to circumcise themselves as a sacrifice. And so all of the Canaanite men had to agree to circumcise themselves, and when they were incapacitated in that way, Simeon and Levi led a force of men and they killed all of them. So that the taking over of that whole terrain was resolved in such a way that now Jacob's well and the top of Mount Gerizim were related to the sacrifice and the life of what became the Jewish tradition. Joseph, of course, was sold by his brothers into slavery into Egypt. But Joseph was the most talented figure of his day, and he rose to become the literally what we would call today the prime minister of Egypt. And he's the one that ran Egypt so well that because Joseph was visionary. He was like his father Jacob. He could see angelic orders in his vision, and he could discern them as spiritual forms. Jacob is famous for two visions, one of seeing the angels ascending and descending on a ladder, God's ladder linking heaven and earth. William Blake has a beautiful print of that. And the other is that he had a personal wrestling match with an angel who came to punish him and dislocated his hip so that Jacob was crippled ever after that. Joseph had the visionary sense, and he's the one that saved Egypt from 7 years of plague and of famine, because he had prepared for 7 years before that. So 2 times 7 again. Instead of gaining wives, he gained the trust of all of Egypt as the overseer of the integrity of Egypt. And then the Hyksos came and took over everything. But before that happened, and right at that time, Joseph made his brothers promise that he would be buried next to Jacob's well. And so Joseph's tomb is there with Jacob's well as a pair. A tomb, a burial plot like that forever, consecrates the ground. It consecrates it in that now on top of that ground, one could build a temple. All temples are based on the consecration of death linking. The woman taken in adultery actually came to Jacob's well when Jesus was in Samaria. And his standing was standing on Joseph's tomb. And he had a right to stand on Joseph's tomb because Benjamin, when he was born when Jacob and the old Rachel were moving their caravan down to Beersheba, and she died in a crossroads that today is Bethlehem. So that she died in childbirth, so that Benjamin was born in Bethlehem. And 1,000 years later, King David was born in Bethlehem. And 1,000 years later, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So that Benjamin, David, and Jesus are a 2,000-year, a double millennium, aeon, that takes place born in Bethlehem. But the sanctification of it was where the well and the tomb was. Not where the nativity was, but the well and the tomb. And the well and the tomb were there under Mount Gerizim. Just outside of Shechem today is called Nablus. Jesus stood on the spot of Joseph's tomb to let the woman, not in adultery, but a woman who came to get water from the well. Jacob's well is about 120 feet deep, a very deep well. And he asked for a drink of water. And she got into a conversation, and she realized that he was a very magical, visionary, special person. Extraordinary. And he knew that she had had 5 husbands and that the man she was living with now wasn't her husband. It was the 6th man in her life, and that she'd given up on marriage. And he let her go because he realized that life had become so scrambled it was not possible to have, for most people, marriages. And that they did the best they could to just continue just to live. And so the consecration there is not letting the woman go from adultery because no one could cast the first stone. His audience were not the people from the temple. His audience were the disciples, the apostles, because none of them understood. They thought that he was going to be strict like John the Baptist, like the Essenes. We want a strict observance of the law, and what Jesus was showing is that this is an expansive harmonic where the law must give way to indefinite possibilities of life in the Spirit. And he says at the well, he says, God is a spirit and is worshipped in spirit and truth, not by law. There's much more. We'll take a look next week at some of it. Thank you.